Hello, this week we are moving on to the next of our negotiating skills or approaches, or actually both, which is negotiation, which is both an approach to problem solving and a set of skills. Now, obviously, we can't do an entire course in negotiation in 1 week, but I thought it's a good time to introduce some of the core elements and to get you starting to think about the role of negotiation in strategy more generally. Because negotiation is clearly a set of individual skills. It's something you can practice, something you can get better at, something that different people have different capabilities of. But it also is a form of approach. It's a way of thinking. Negotiation is a strategy as distinct from, say, confrontation or an adversarial approach. And in many issues, negotiation is a better approach than any of the more hostile ones. It's the essence of what diplomacy is. So we're going to talk about that as a way. I think it underpins a lot of the other approaches we're going to talk about strategically throughout the term. Generally speaking, unless there's someone who is behaving in a way that is very much outside of what they're supposed to be doing, as justice professionals, negotiation is the only way to go. In terms of skill sets, it's not something that everyone enjoys, it's not something everyone's good at, but I think everyone needs to know about it. I think all teams need to be built with a variety of different skills. And I think that having at least one good negotiator on any particular team is invaluable. Even if what you're doing seems to be more abstract and not political, I just think it's really good to have someone who is good at picking out the times when you need to actually get into those kind of arrangements with others, whether they're people you're working with, working against, or just need to be conscious of. Now, next week, we're looking at building collaborations and building networks across organisations. But negotiation is something that works inside an organisation, between organisations and stakeholders and everything else. So I think it's a really good foundation, and I think it's a really good example of sometimes our approaches to strategy do not involve a great master plan or a Machiavellian set of four-dimensional chess moves or whatever. That sometimes just being open to negotiation, to listening and understanding other people's interests is profoundly the best strategy, at least to start with. And it's certainly the most accountable one if we're dealing with public organisations. So don't forget later on when we talk about, particularly for assessment, what is the best strategy for this situation. Negotiation is a strategy. It is a way. It is an approach, and it's a way of thinking. All right, so there's some general material in the study guide on approaches to negotiation. The one you might find most interesting and most surprising is the role of storytelling in negotiation, and I think that's really important. And too often negotiators go into the field with a checklist of different goals and points and what interests to tick off, but miss the bigger picture of being able to tell a compelling story about why it is you're doing what you're doing. So I think that's a very relevant thing for us to be able to think about when we start planning what we're going to do in terms of negotiation. All right, I also have done a really brief summary of some of the main themes and different approaches to negotiation that comes out of the literature. And while this isn't rigorously tested experimental academic literature, it is the sort of literature that's used a lot. So it's useful, it's good to reference, it's good to reference in your assignments, it's good to include, but it's usually just the experiential advice from someone with experience in the field, and thus it is completely open to be challenged and questioned, which other people do. And I guess we do that with scientific research as well. But unlike ordinary academic research where you'd expect there to be a list of whole cases and citations and experiments that support these contentions, usually these books are written on the basis of the experience of the author. So just be conscious of that. I don't think we're going to get more academic information on some of this stuff. But yeah, be conscious of the fact that just because Fisher and Urey say this is one of the, the 10 rules, doesn't mean that anyone's gone through and tried to verify those in scientific experiments or anything else. So there's a few different things I'll let you read up on. There's not a huge amount of reading there. The idea of the zero-sum game is very important to think about. It's a more of a misconception about negotiation than anything else, and that's the idea of there being a fixed pie, and that anything that you give away, anything anyone else gains is something that you lose. And this, I guess, is a way a lot of people negotiate. A lot of people put their pride on the line when they negotiate, and definitely are very reluctant to make concessions to others. And that's because of this misapprehension that everything is zero-sum, that there are no win-win situations. It's always win-lose. And, that's not a strategy. That's just something. It is a strategy that people use, but it's one that we need to rebut. It's something we need to think about, and think about that we don't do it ourselves, and identifying when others do it. The next one I give a summary of, and with all the major points in bold there, so to make it easy for you, is Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes, which was a bit of a manual, handbook, Bible for business negotiations. Its propositions are quite good, though. I don't think they're universally good, and they're not appropriate in all situations. But I think some of the ideas there, particularly about interests and positions, is quite good, and ties into that fact that, and we've covered some of that if you've done understanding conflict and violence previously, that idea that people form these positions of, again, the win-lose or adversarial positions, and if you dig into what their interests are, you'll probably find there are common interests that can be shared rather than focus on these positions, these stances that people take in conflict with each other. So it is still fairly businessy in its orientation, but it's become a really standard book. The book that has been, I think, the most influential in changing some of those ideas is Never Split the Difference. And that's a book written by a hostage negotiator. And it directly challenges some of the ideas in the Getting to Yes idea, the Getting to Yes philosophy. I think it's very useful. I don't necessarily agree with all of that either, but there's some really useful suggestions which I've put, bold heading summaries under there for you to able to access and think about without having to read the whole book. That being said, both books are quite good things to have on your bookshelf, particularly if you have goals to be a leader in the justice professions later on. And these are things that are extremely useful ideas to have at your fingertips. All right. The next section talks about risks and ethical issues. This is a key part of strategy generally, but it's something I thought it's important to point out at the very beginning, that there are ethical aspects to any of these decisions that we make, and definitely ethical aspects to strategy. And going hardball in negotiation or exploiting someone's weakness or an organisation's weakness may be a good way of getting your own way, but you do always have to consider the ethical context of that. I'm not going to say a lot about it now, but I just wanted to raise that in case I was giving the misleading impression in selling the idea of negotiation as a tactic that this was like negotiation at all costs, that this was a ruthless proposition, that it did not have an ethical context. So I just want to firmly state there is an ethical context. Related to that, the next section does talk about the stress management aspects of the of the strategy environment, particularly in negotiation. Again, not going to do a heap on that right now, but early in the course, I think it's really important to point out that these are parts of the decisions that you make. And going into a situation, you are going to be, in the strategies that you adopt, you are going to be looking at the overall impact of those decisions that you make, and some of that will involve the stress and the impact it has on people around you. And sometimes negotiating hard to get just the right answer can cause, or the right solution for yourself, can cause more stress to yourself and your team than accepting a compromise. And it's always worth bearing that in mind, because there are certain personality types who are the win at all cost, and they are the people who will burn out people around them and members of their team, able to get a millimetre more gain on a negotiation. And having a more ethical, team-based perspective, sometimes it's easy to go, look, we'll make a concession. It's not exactly ideal, but we have to weigh up, on the one hand, the effort it's going to take to get exactly what we want against the impact it's going to have, and the other things we could use that energy for. It may be that we could accept a compromise on this and give us more time and energy to focus where we can make more difference. Now, in terms of the reading for this week, as usual, there's a guide in the book to the reading, but the reading itself is really worthwhile reading and making notes of in depth. As I've said previously, I don't give the readings just to give you busy work each week. There are sincerely ones that I think the actual text is worth spending some time with, thinking about and understanding. But in terms of the overall thingness of for the want of a better word, of this article, it's about power in negotiation and thinking about how we understand power, how we detect power, how we model power, how we talk about power when we're developing strategy. And one of the things that's quite cool about this is the dynamic model of power, which I will let you explore in your own time. But it can be easy to form ourselves into really static, monolithic ideas of power. We are the poor and they are the rich. We are, the people who work under the system, and these are the masters of the system, or various other forms of power. And this is something we're going to explore using this article in the workshop this week. But power is dynamic. It shifts, and it can shift very quickly over time. This is your Game of Thrones style stuff. You can be completely on the losing end of something, and something can happen, and suddenly the power shifts around you. And someone who's a good negotiator and a good strategist will be able to be aware of those and detect those, because sometimes you're not going to get a direct message that says, by the way, the power has now shifted and you now have leverage over this other person. You're going to be looking for traces of the ways in which they change their behavior, the way in which their outward appearance changes, to be able to realize that you may have a different set of power relationships than what you began with. So I know some of you will be seeing this in abject horror, and the idea of getting into confrontations with people and getting into sort of heated negotiations or serious negotiations is your idea of hell. And I don't blame you, and I don't think that you have to push yourself into a situation where you're doing this as part of your professional lives, and hopefully you don't get pushed into this. However, I think it's important for everyone to have a baseline understanding of this stuff so that they can be able to contribute to collaborative decision making when time goes on. And as I said at the outset of this video, having someone who is a skilled negotiator, a people person as part of the team, I think is absolutely crucial when you put teams together. But also having, lots of eyes on the problem as well, and having, while that person is negotiating, have someone who can watch the other organisation and can say, like, I detected this, or I thought this was going on, and leading to that discussion to help understand the way in which you form strategies. There's a reference to, pardon me, the BATNAs there. It's important to know what a BATNA is, and you can read that for yourself. And also that idea of perceived power, I think, is something to think about as well. Our Game of Thrones is often a shadow game. There's a great quote and counter quote. Chairman Mao Zedong once said power comes from a barrel of a gun. Very pragmatic idea of power. But the writer Jean Genet said that power can also come from the shadow of the barrel of a gun. And I think that is a much more complex, nuanced understanding of power. And it is often about the representation and perception of power. Anyway, the workshop for this week is all about negotiation and about forming a strategy and trying to align various interest groups along that way. So I think that's a fun one. It ties back, of course, into the simulation that we're not using, but you don't need knowledge from the simulation to do this. This is just one of the issues that's facing the groups in the simulation. We have enough in the workshop this week to work through that by ourselves, just in isolation, and I think that'll be quite useful. And also finally, I recommend the game Dead of Winter. Those of you out there who are interested in using board games to advance your skills and study, Dead of Winter is a fascinating game that's a zombie Holocaust survival style game, but it's based around a community of survivors, one of which may be a traitor, and you have to make decisions for the benefit of your community, to protect your community, going in an ongoing basis from turn to turn, but everyone has a secret agenda, and one of those secret agendas may be a traitor who's actually working against the interest of the rest of the group quite directly. So in terms of our ideas of negotiation, it's a really interesting one to look at, and if you have access to it, or maybe a game cafe or somewhere where you can go and play it, I think you can probably learn just as much from Dead of Winter as you can from the reading for this week, although I'm not saying you shouldn't do the reading for this week either. All right, I will see you in class this week.